Well, haven't talked to you in a while.
It's been a long time. What is it? We haven't recorded since late September. Oh my god.
We have not recorded since late September. It has been, yeah, a month and a half basically. Ooh, what's new in your life?
So I'm a senior, so I just applied for some colleges for the early decision deadline, which was November 1st. I have another deadline November 15th, which is for the University of Washington and their really annoying coalition app application. But so I got those applications done, and then I was in Chicago mid October to look at some colleges there, which was a nice break because I hadn't actually been on a plane in October in a very long time. It actually was, I think, my first flight ever in October, which was a nice break because usually I'm just in school for the entire month, so it's nice to take some time off. But I know that in comparison to what you did, that was much less interesting.
Well, no, 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 no. You can't say that. So, how was your flight? Where'd you go to and from?
I flew from San Francisco to Chicago O'Hare round trip, and then on Wednesday of the week we flew from Midway to St. Louis in the morning and back in the evening on a day trip. So I got to use both Chicago airports, and then we flew United to Chicago, and then we flew Southwest between Chicago and St. Louis. But that was
Wait,
it for
why?
flights.
Why wouldn't you take like the train, Amtrak between Chicago and St.
You know, we
Louis?
we considered that, but since we were only in St. Louis for the day, and we wanted to look at Washington University around like 10, 11 a.m. Since the train is 6 hours or 5.5 hours there, I think it was really inconvenient because you would have to leave early at like 6 a.m. and then you have to leave at like 4 p.m. So you're really only there for 4 hours, and it's also more expensive. I think it was more expensive than flying too.
Hmm. I mean, because like that's what you usually associate with like Amtrak service in the Midwest, like Chicago to St. Louis. It's one of the quintessential routes, eh?
Yes, but we that's true. But we did actually end up taking Amtrak anyway because we went to Champaign to look at
Oh,
UIUC. So we took the train to Champaign from Chicago.
did you? Okay. At least you got some Amtrak, because they offer a lot of service in
Yeah, we
the
were
state of
we were not going to
Illinois.
let that opportunity go by, and now that makes it three for three. So every time I've been to Chicago, I also happen to take an Amtrak train either to Chicago or from Chicago. So that was a good streak to continue.
Next time, maybe perhaps you can go to Chicago and then take the Amtrak, the Cardinal to Cincinnati.
I know, and I wanted to do that, but since you were in Wales, that wasn't probably the right time to
Well,
do that.
actually, not anymore. I am currently in Scotland, not Wales anymore.
Right, and you're in Edinburgh, yes?
I am in Edinburgh. It's I'm staying with my cousin here. For Well, I've been here for a week already. So basically, since the beginning of November and until November 23rd, I think. I will be basically still in the UK and afterwards returning to the United States.
And so, what's Edinburgh like? I hear that it's pretty drab weather-wise usually, but I hear great reviews.
Yeah, it's cold, dark, and depressing. Um, which I mean, I guess sort of sums up the United Kingdom in general, because it's sort of all like this. But for Edinburgh, I mean, to be fair, to be honest, the majority of my time here has actually been just studying, catching up on work because the past month I've been so busy with volunteering that I couldn't really do much else. But yeah, no, today I did take a walk to Arthur's Seat, which is in Hollywood Park, Hollywood Road Park. I don't know how you say it actually. Um, which is like, a big rock formation right next to Edinburgh. Went to the top. It's a decently strenuous hike if you haven't exercised for like a month.
Hmm.
Um, but it was quite nice. The views of the city were amazing. So
Yeah, it sounds pretty nice as a city, and they have a tram too, right? Have you been on that?
they do have the tram. I have not been on the tram system yet. The problem is it runs to and from between the airport and the city center. And the way I arrived in Edinburgh was actually it's a really long story, but to cut it short, I took a train from Wales to Birmingham, then took a coach up from Birmingham to Glasgow, and then took the train from Glasgow to Edinburgh. So I just arrived directly into the city center and then walked to my cousin's place where I'm staying. So I haven't had the need to use the tram yet, but maybe I will use it soon because I will be flying from Edinburgh in 3 days actually
And
from
so I
when
guess
we
that
record.
prompts the question of where are you flying to?
Well, I mean, obviously, but let's do this first, right? If you didn't know, where would you have guessed? I say, hey, I'm flying to somewhere in Europe from Edinburgh. It's a pretty neat place. It's a little bit unusual. Where would you have guessed?
Well, I know that you were a stickler for off the beaten path places, and I guess you've I think expressed sentiment in the past that Western Europe is rather boring. So I would guess somewhere in Eastern Europe. Maybe like Belarus or like Poland.
Those would be really good. Those would be really good places. I'm pretty sure you need a visa with an American passport to go to Belarus, actually. Um, and I mean, to be fair, I legitimately would have loved to go to Russia this time. Unfortunately, I do not have the visa. Um, but but I mean, as you know, right? I've told you, Eastern Europe. You're correct that Western Europe I do find slightly overrated, and partially because there's a billion opportunities to go there in the future, which is why in 3 days, as we record, I will be going to Estonia, um, for basically half a week, in Tallinn and then around Estonia itself. But I will also have, and here's the amazing bit, which I've told you about, but which is still surprising me even all these hours later. It is a flight between Ryanair, of course, but it is between Edinburgh to Estonia via Malta.
Which is just so
Like,
random that exists because there is a nonstop flight from Edinburgh to Tallinn.
there is, but the thing is, like, another thing is, even if you were to have a stop, right, which isn't unexpected, you wouldn't expect it between that city pair to be Malta. It's like way far north to way far south. It's I still don't know what to make of it.
Well, and because I would think that the most people going to Malta are just gonna actually like stay there and not actually transfer, especially because it's so far south. And I
Well, that's
guess
exactly
maybe
right.
it seems maybe it's just like Skyscanner throwing some flights together because it is a 19-hour layover, so it's not exactly timed for a transfer. But then again, it gives you the time to stay there.
It does give me the time to stay there, which is amazing. Because the itinerary is here. Let me see. Let me pull it up. I booked this ticket quite like I paid for it quite literally just right before we started recording. Depart Edinburgh 6 a.m. and then arrive in Malta 11 a.m. and then departing Malta to Estonia at 6 a.m. 6:45 the next day. So it's basically from 11 a.m. until the early morning of next day. I have time to spend in Malta, which is really amazing, because Malta is certainly, at least by American standards, not you know on the beaten path at all. Um, should be really cool, but still, right? I still shocked that this is an option.
Yeah. Well, and,
Scotland
and
to Estonia.
how much did it cost all in to fly through Malta? Because for the viewers out there who are interested, because obviously Ryanair has cheap fares.
Well, Ryanair does have cheap fares. I was actually looking at, there was another option, just direct Edinburgh Tallinn and then back Tallinn to Edinburgh, and that would have cost a total of 8 British pounds, which is 11 US dollars. But the thing is, for this one, right? For this flight that I booked, it includes the stop in Malta as well as 2 additional days in Tallinn. It cost 29 British pounds, which is 39 US dollars. So it is, decently more expensive, especially by Ryanair standards. But the additional time in not only Estonia and Malta, but also Malta, I figured, wow, this is not something you come by every day.
Oh, for
It's one of
sure. And
those.
and comparatively, that's still cheaper than anything you can get on Southwest or any other low cost carrier in the U.S. for the most part.
I mean, Southwest is basically like they're a poser these days.
To the point where their cheapest fares are I think 49 one way or something.
Yeah, I mean, even like from big cities, I was looking at flights from Chicago Midway the other day, and it's just like 200 between that and, like, I don't know, it's another city I forgot, but it's not Ryanair, not even remotely close to Ryanair standards. Um, but yeah, Malta and Estonia, talk about off the beaten path.
And you said you were gonna try to go to the Russian border, yes? What's that like? What do you plan to do there?
Well, I mean, it's actually a decently famous thing, tourist thing to do, as you know, of those who go to go to Estonia in the first place. So Tallinn is of course the big city, the capital city, but the town of Narva is by the border, the Russian border, and so there's this really famous place where you know the border is on the river, and there are opposing castles basically on each side of the border. And so the sort of touristy thing to do is to go up to the castle, right? And then stand on the Estonian side and then just look across the river to Russia. Because obviously it is such a clash of, you know, the landscape isn't different at all. Um, the weather isn't different at all, but it's such a clash of what it represents because, you know, you have Western, well, um, politically Western EU Estonia, just right across the border from you know Putin's Russia, which
Right.
is really it's really interesting when you think about it. But that should be pretty interesting. I'm also planning to take spend a day taking the ferry from Estonia to Helsinki, um, and otherwise just mostly spending Estonia wandering
Yeah.
around.
The ferry is still the only way to get to Helsinki, right? Because I'd heard at one point they were planning on building a tunnel, but I don't think that's done yet.
Well, what you can do is you can take a train or a bus from Tallinn all the way to St. Petersburg in Russia and then back up to Helsinki.
But that would be a lot longer though. Like how long is the ferry?
How long is the ferry? That's a good question. How long is the Tallinn to Helsinki? It is 2 hours. Oh, really? That's longer than I thought.
Well, I guess if you leave at like 8 a.m., get there at 10, and then take a ferry at like 8 p.m. home, I mean that's a decent amount of time in Helsinki.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that would make like for a perfect day trip. Which I think is what a lot of people do. Although, admittedly, most people start on the Helsinki side and then go down to Tallinn. But hey, again, maybe sort of changing it up a bit, you know? That's what I'm
Yeah,
all
that
about.
seems to be a theme in all of your travels with spontaneous decision making.
It's super spontaneous. I found this fair literally today, um, and I just had to go for it. You know, it's wow. You know, it's not once in a lifetime, but it is you know unique. We'll say.
Yeah, for sure. And so once you go to Eastern Europe, then you come back to Edinburgh, right? And then you go home to Cincinnati eventually, like later this month.
Well, I will be going home to Cincinnati later this month, but so what I'll do is I'll fly from Edinburgh to Malta to Estonia, and then do all this stuff in Estonia, and then fly back directly to Edinburgh. But you know, from last month, volunteering on the Tailteann Railway in Wales, which by the way, I think we'll absolutely need to do an episode about because there is a lot of things to talk about, especially as outside, you know, for an outsider experience on one of these heritage steam railways in the UK. It's quite special. But what I'm planning to do from Edinburgh is to I need to slowly make it. I need to make my way back to London because I'm flying from London Heathrow out. Um, I have a friend in York, Old York, who you know, who is also a big railway fan, and is also where the railway museum is. So I will be going to York, and then in the Great Central Railway, another heritage steam railway, which is in Loughborough, which is close to Nottingham, which is close to Birmingham. Um, that is where I'll also be going with another friend who I met last month to a sort of end of year gala where they run the steam trains for the last time before they close for the year. So I'll be going to York, then to there, and then down to London, and then flying away. So certainly not as easy as just taking the straight coach between Edinburgh and London, you know, the one way service, but hopefully it should be pretty nice as well.
Yeah. Have you considered the new Lumo train that just operated? Because I've seen so many videos on that on YouTube, but I guess it's more expensive than they advertise.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Like I was looking at prices, and I can't name exact numbers because I'm horrible with those, but they are still expensive than the coach ticket. Like obviously, I
Yeah.
mean, you know, they are decently cheaper than the other train fares, but the other train fares are basically like 150 effectively between Edinburgh and London. So, it's still tens, like what, 50, 60, 70. And the problem is, as with all train tickets, right? It's for I would totally love to do that. The problem is because of these intermediate stations, right? These intermediate stops, I can't just take the full ride between Edinburgh and London. I suppose what I could try to do is maybe take the Edinburgh to York portion on Lumo, but I mean because it's new and because they're advertising low prices, a lot of the dates have sold out completely. Um,
Oh, really? I didn't realize it was that popular.
well, I mean, because the train tickets in the UK are nothing but horribly expensive.
Yeah.
Like for example, the ticket I bought between Birmingham and Tywin in Wales, which is where um, the Heritage Steam Railway is, that cost £33, which is 44 US dollars for a 2.5 hour trip.
Yeah, that's not good. I mean, I guess for the US it's kind of that'd probably be cheap, but
I mean,
you know.
the thing is, like, I mean, I don't know, with Amtrak, like, from Chicago to Los Angeles one way for like what, 55 hours, it only costs like 170.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the long
So,
distance trains are a good deal, but at least in the Bay Area, the Amtrak California trains are pretty expensive. Like
oh, for sure.
I just paid I think it was $16 for a 45-minute train ride
Mm,
from
yeah.
it was like
I,
Richmond to Sassoon City.
that's why like where I can in the UK, I'm opting to go for coach. Like, on my way going to Wales, I took a coach between London and Birmingham for £3, which is $4. And it's a 2 hour trip, so
Yeah, which is
that was
obviously
really good
a better
value.
deal.
Certainly, very much so. But Lumo, I don't know. I guess maybe we can talk about that in another episode too. Oh, another new episode idea. Talk about how they're faring and how they'll do in the future. But oh, I will have a pretty decently packed travel schedule for the rest of this month.
Yeah, that's an understatement. But I'm actually very excited to hear what Malta is like and Ryanair because I've never been on Ryanair and would love to hear if it's actually as bad as people say.
It's funny how the final destination is Estonia, but like Malta is getting more attention, which I think goes to show just how little we think about that in the United States. Like it is like such a small country, but like still.
Yeah, certainly Estonia has more name recognition, and you would think Malta is more popular because it's in the Mediterranean and it's like tourist haven.
Well, I mean it's definitely more well known with Europeans.
Yeah,
Well, I mean like duh, but um, yeah. The thing is like because I found this fair only today. My problem is that I wasn't expecting to find this at all. I wasn't expecting to find this itinerary between Edinburgh, Malta, and Estonia. So I did not do any research on Malta, and I have no idea what to do. And the problem is, Malta is not one of those countries where it's like, okay, there are these set things that like are sort of everybody needs to go do, right? Where it's like, I don't know what's a good example really. Go to Rome, Colosseum, Roman things, the Vatican, right? With Malta, it's so much stuff packed into these few islands that it's sort of just super disorientating, not gonna lie.
yeah,
But they do have a very good public bus system, so that should be pretty
yeah. It
convenient.
looks like that's comprehensive, and it looks like they have a ton of different cliffs you can go to along the
Oh, the
south
cliffs of
side.
Malta, yeah, the cliffs of Malta are really really famous too. That's right. We'll see though. The weather's not going to be amazing. At least it's not forecasted to be amazing, but we shall
Well,
see.
well, it's November. I don't think it's exactly tourist season there or good weather season.
It's not touristy like anywhere right now. Oh, Estonia will be even worse because it will be freezing cold. So,
But anyway, onto the topic of today's episode. Um, there's a different London in the world, and it's not in the UK. It's in Canada, and interestingly, they will now have a new rail service offered by Go Transit which I believe has actually started service already. I think on October 18th, or yeah, that was a Monday. Um, so they're now operating one train per day from Toronto to London, which is a very interesting idea because, as we'll talk about, it's a 4 hour train ride just to go from Toronto to London.
Mm-hmm. So let's set the stage first, right? So Go Transit is the name of the commuter rail system in Toronto, like serving the Toronto area of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And like, by the way, just before anything, fun fact: do you know why Go Transit is called Go Transit?
So I was actually watching a video. Is it just the government of Ontario like compacted into an acronym?
Yeah, basically, like, oh, government of Ontario, but also, hey, it's the
It's
word
a really
go.
good name actually.
It is. I mean, it's good because it actually represents something that's beyond, the word go, which if it were just by itself would be slightly gimmicky, but if it represents government of Ontario, that's pretty nice. Um, but yeah, so the Go trains are sort of they're pretty famous in the transit world because they have the distinctive green livery and they operate numerous lines. How many lines in total? One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. I'm sorry. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. Seven lines in the Toronto area, all in a very hub and spoke model between Union Station in downtown Toronto and the various suburbs in different directions. This planned extension to London, Ontario, which, by the way, is another city in sort of the middle, like almost exactly in the middle between Toronto, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, in the U.S. So basically, by car at least, right? Driving from Toronto to Detroit takes around 4 hours, and London is smack dab in the middle of that. So 2 hours between Detroit and London, and 2 hours between London and Toronto. And what Go Transit is doing is they are extending their current service from Toronto to Kitchener, which is another city between London and Toronto, and they're extending it all the way to London, right?
Yeah.
Which will be exactly what we're going to talk about. But right now, they are actually in still the pilot stage, so still doing a lot of tests. I believe they stated that this would continue for 2 years. Um,
Yeah.
2 years of sort of running these sort of test trains between London and Toronto to see how they fare in the first place. Um, and but yeah, like you said before, right now there will be a connection between London and Toronto that is not either car or the existing national railway network of Canada, which is called Via Rail Canada.
hmm Well, and Via Rail does operate between Toronto and London, I believe, on both its routes to Sarnia and Windsor. But they used like the same trackage as the Lakeshore West Line along Lake Ontario. And it takes, I believe, 2 hours and 10 minutes or something to go to London. But then this Go Transit service uses completely separate trackage, just extending from the Kitchener Waterloo area down to London, which I also heard in a video is it has slow speeds, which creates like the long travel time, like the 4 hour travel time from Toronto to London, which I think it's interesting that so it is a pilot program and they're only running one train a day, but it doesn't seem like it will have a lot of appeal because you can already use Via Rail if you're wanting to go to London. So I think in reality it would just be used for especially the residents of Stratford and St. Mary's, which are the new stations that Go Transit is now serving.
Well, that's certainly the aim of Go Transit, right? So Stratford and St. Mary's are two other intermediate tiny towns, really. They are towns, they're not cities by any means. That are again between Kitchener, Waterloo, and London. That's certainly one of the aims, and it's also one of the big defenses defensive talking points of this extension, that it's not just about offering connections between London and Toronto, but also for the intermediate stations. The problem with that though is you have to also consider, right? Even though you have to consider that there will be some people who will use this service between St. Mary's, Stratford, these tiny towns in London and Toronto, the whole journey will still take 4 hours, which in commuter rail terms is sort of like really long,
Well,
right?
yeah, that would mean if you're living in London and commuting to Toronto, that's 8 hours of commuting a day, which is completely crazy. Um, but what's even more confusing to me is that they actually designed the schedule around commuting. The train in the morning leaves London at 5:20, and then it gets to Toronto I think at like 9:30 something or 9:10. So like, I mean 9:15 or whatever it gets to Toronto is relatively late, but it's designed as if you could commute, which is so interesting because I don't think it really serves that purpose very well if it's 4 hours.
Well, I mean that is again, one of the sort of main arguments, right? Um, because people again bring up this talking point of the intermediate stations. If you're commuting from London to Toronto, that's kind of ridiculous. But if you're sort of talking about St. Mary's or Stratford going to and from London or Toronto, then it how do we say this, right? If you're a resident living in one of those two little tiny areas and you need to be in Toronto for the day, this is an excellent option to have, right?
Yeah.
The problem, and please tell me what you think about this as well. The problem though is that I don't think this is just a problem for this one extension, but it's a problem for the entirety of the Go Transit network. Because what Go Transit does for most of their lines is operate very much based on a commuter schedule, right?
Yeah.
So like, and what that means basically is obviously as a commuter, obviously as a very hub and spoke commuter rail system, they only operate between different lines, set lines stemming from Toronto Union Station. There's no intersection of any line anywhere outside of Toronto Union Station. But the problem is because they're operating in this commuter system, right? Trains going into Toronto from any of the different spokes, they only have trains very early in the morning and usually at hourly or half hourly intervals, right? So they may operate at 5:30, 5:30, 6:30, 7:30, and that's it. And then trains don't start again until the evening when they run only in the other direction, right? So in the evening, like 6:30, 6:30, 7:30. And it seems if they're trying to extend this sort of type of service to London, I I personally think it just raises so much more questions about what exactly Go Transit is trying to be, and if you're doing that, then doesn't that sort of defeat the whole purpose of offering more convenient connections to the intermediates?
Right. Well, because with the exception of the Lakeshore West route, trains I believe are entirely based on rush hour, and even this London service is based on rush hour and seemingly aimed for commuters, and maybe there are commuters who want to go to like Kitchener from Stratford or St. Mary's, which that would be totally reasonable. But theoretically, the system is very well equipped to be a regional rail system because it has the density and it has. Go certainly has the train capacity with all the rail cars and rolling stock they own, and they get quite good ridership on the rush hour routes. But I don't feel like they care enough to prioritize the midday service or prioritize the weekend service, which they have very little of. And I guess most riders share that thought that Go could certainly be more ambitious in the type of service they're offering. And I guess Go Transit has tried to mitigate that, and they've expanded services on the Lakeshore West Line and even to Niagara Falls. But I think there's gaps that they could fill in, especially to this. I think the London Pilot service is good because the Toronto to London corridor could be used as a regional rail with all of the, especially with the university in Waterloo right next to Kitchener and some of the other suburbs. But we'll see if Go Transit actually takes those steps.
Let me ask you this question, which I think is also important to sort of establish first. Do you have any experience with Toronto or with Go Transit?
I've not been on Go Transit. I have been to Toronto, so I've been on the TTC subway, but I've not been on the train. I've watched videos, and it's actually interesting. I think the U.S. kind of should emulate GO Transit in a lot of ways because it's a really good commuter rail system that I think improves a lot of elements of the U.S. systems because it's massive. But I have not been on it at all.
I mean, well, see, like my family, like I have an aunt and uncle who live in another small. It's not on the Go Chance network. It's not in Toronto, but it's another small town in that area. And I have lots of. I've taken Go Transit many, many, many times. I remember when I was writing my college application essays from last year, because of the stress, right, and because I don't function well being creative on a desk, I would drive from that little small town to the nearest Go Transit station and just sit on the Go train, take it all the way to the other side of the Toronto suburbs, and then take it all the way back, just typing out my essays. Um, but here's the thing, right? And this is what's relevant to this whole London extension. Um, the station that I would usually drive to is exactly like you said on the Lakeshore West line, the station of Aldershot in Burlington, Ontario, right? And so with the Lakeshore West line, as you said, it is basically service for the entire day, right? So not on a commuter schedule, not in only in the morning and only in the night. It operates, I believe it operated like once every half hour, like alternating each direction,
Yeah.
I believe. And that was really good because it meant that I could drive there, for me at least, I could drive there at any time and then be able to get to Toronto soon, right? Get on the train to Toronto soon without having much of a fuss. And doing so at that time, right, was also really convenient for the people around me. I saw it because it was decently. There were quite a lot of people like that. Quite a lot of people utilizing that sort of service, right?
Right.
The problem with what I think operating this new extension to London is exactly that, the schedule. I've actually taken, this one time, only once have I ever taken the Kitchener line. And I did it only because I really, really wanted to. I had to wake up at like 4 a.m., right? Drive the 1 hour to Kitchener, and then be able to catch the 5 a.m. train, which would then arrive in Toronto at like, what, 7 a.m. It was a 2 hour train, 2 hour blitz like that. And it was, to put it lightly, really not amazing at all, right? Because you had to wake up early, early, early in the morning, and there were only those set trains. If you missed one, the next one was not for an hour, right? If you missed that one, the next one was not for an hour, and if you missed that one, sorry, there's no more go trains, right? Tough luck. If you're sort of extending it to London, right? Remember that situation with the schedules, this limited schedules, that was just to Kitchener, and it was only 2 hours, right?
Right.
So there was plausible, alternatives. Let's say you are in London, right, and you want to catch one of these trains to Toronto. If there's any sorts of disruption, right? If there's any sorts of, you know, if there's any sort of disruption, if you miss your train, then there's no other options offered by Go because it is on such a constraint. It will cost so much to be operating more and more trains, and the utilization would not be amazing because again, this is another big problem. If you live in London, your job and everything else is probably going to be in London. If you live in Toronto, almost your life will be, everything you do will probably also be in Toronto, right? Why would you need to go to the other city to sort of accomplish your affairs? And even if you did, you know, this is by no means a shuttle service, right? It's very, very limited in its options.
Right. Well, that's where I think it's the emphasis on it being a pilot program is important because I think functionally right now it has no use because for commuters they can just use Via Rail. Via Rail is quicker and it still can get you. It leaves London later. It leaves at like 6:30 and then it gets to Toronto at like 8:40. So it's even better for commuters. So really, I think it I guess its only use is in Stratford and St. Mary's right now, and Like the Stratford schedule, you have the train to Toronto at 6:43, and then you have the Via Rail at 8:32. So, I mean, I guess if you miss the Go, you can take the Via Rail, but I functionally I don't really unless you're commuting to Kitchener, I don't think the Go is that useful. And even if they add more trains, it's still going to be competing with the speed of the Via Rail from London directly, and I don't. That certainly wouldn't win unless you're commuting from Stratford or St. Mary's.
I mean, here's another thing, right? We're sort of, talking about many different factors, many different problems. But another big problem, which sort of seems to be overlooked, is Stratford and St. Mary's are by no means large population centers at all. St. Mary's doesn't it is like barely even a town, right? If you look on even if you look on a map, right? It
Yeah,
has
its
like what a
population is
total
just over 7,000.
7,000, right? 7,000. And you're extending a train into the middle of nowhere to get to what? London, Ontario, which is 4 hours away, right? It'd basically be the equivalent of saying, right, okay, here is its total is a 4 hour train line, right? The total of it'd be like saying, okay, we're gonna start a new commuter train line that runs from Boston, right, into the middle of the mountains in New Hampshire because because there are some towns which are along the way. Maybe that's not the best comparison. Actually, that's kind of a horrible comparison. Maybe a better comparison is between New York and Boston, right? Connecting a few small towns in between. It would make
Yeah.
sense, obviously, on a national rail level, right? Because that's the whole purpose of national rail. That's the purpose of Via Rail. But for Go Transit itself, which is on exclusively for the Toronto area, is this really the best option to sort of extend to another city that's part of a different metro area completely, just to service two small towns that combined don't have the population of like some of Toronto's neighborhoods?
Hmm. I mean, on the point about small towns, I think when you consider Go, a new Go station doesn't necessarily serve just a small town. Like take for example the Bloomington station, which is effectively in the middle of nowhere, uh, and really, you could fill up the parking garage there with more people than the entire population of St. Mary's. So to some degree, and I guess maybe St. Mary's doesn't really fall into this category because they don't have a Go Transit station. It's more of a Via Rail station yet. But I think any new Go station, especially in the way that they're designed, also serves other communities that you can drive to the station from because seemingly Go Transit is really built for that suburbanization that they want to have a bunch of parking spaces attached to the station. And actually, I think I saw in a video today that the government of Ontario, Go Transit, owns more parking spaces than any other operator in Ontario. So maybe they're assuming people will drive to these stations, especially maybe from like um, towns that are on
From like
the eastern end of Lake
e- e-
Huron, maybe.
even smaller towns that like even smaller than Stratford and St. Mary's make drive all the way to use the Go service.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of the pattern that's existing already in a lot of their communities. I think, especially in the north, like they have over 1,000 parking spaces at this new Bloomington station that just opened, which is literally in the middle of nowhere, and you have to drive to the station to get there. So I guess that's maybe the MO they're used to.
I mean, I guess that would be plausible, but again, I mean, I personally think that this is just sort of another like find a reason for a defense, right? Because if you look at the other lines, right? If you look at, for example, the Lakeshore East, which goes all the way to Oshawa, you know, it extends to Oshawa because that is the end of the Toronto suburb, right? The suburb effectively ends there. The people at the next town over, right, in Peterborough, Ontario, or in Belleville, Ontario, right, they are not going to drive, an hour, 2 hours to the Oshawa station and then take that another 2 hours or so into downtown Toronto, right? What Go Transit and what the people there expect to do is to either drive or to take via rail. So that's why I just think it's so baffling that it would be this extension to London would be really utilized because I don't think the demand is there to be able to sustain it. Now, don't get me wrong. I would love, having another option to transit between London and Toronto. Like, yes, all for that. Problem is, I just don't think it's very sustainable because it's sort of demand that you imagine is there, right? But that doesn't really happen in reality, and we've seen this from the other lines too. Um,
Well, and
I
Go
don't know.
Transit too still is 100% made up of commuter rail trains that aren't designed for 4-hour trips. I mean, I don't think there's a single commuter rail system in the U.S. that even you can take for 4 hours on one line. So I think if maybe in the future, once they actually like fully develop the line and get off this pilot program, they'll invest in different in services. And I know they did indicate they want to upgrade the track speed, so it takes 1 hour to go from London to Kitchener rather than two. But right now, that's not happening, and I don't think, and I think that's important. They need a lot of upgrades.
Let's talk about the identity issue, right? So, what exactly does Go Transit want to be? What do you think about this?
Well, I think maybe right now with this London service, they're indicating in their future they do want to be a regional rail service, and in some ways they are, especially with the Lakeshore West line. But they're still largely built around commuter rail. I mean, they are always investing in the newest commuter rail technology. With those like streamlined cab cars, and they're constantly getting new Bombardier bi-level cars. And I believe they were the launch operator in the early '90s or late '80s, whenever it was created. So they're definitely they are the premier commuter rail service in North America, I would think, in terms of um, I guess their ubiquity with commuter rail and with Bombardier. But I think it would be in their best interest to shift their identity to something more of a regional rail, because Toronto is huge, and it is like the largest metropolis in Canada, and with all of the suburban density, and maybe Go Transit has contributed a bit to that density growing when with they literally expand the suburbs, because in large part they're faster than a car. So I think if Go Transit can shift their identity, they can also shift the identity of Toronto to being more of like commuting from suburb to suburb, or just taking day trips from suburb to suburb, which you can't do right now. But maybe that will be in the future.
But here's another thing, right? Like considering considering the current makeup of Go Transit's sort of lines. If you're saying like they should be, a more premier, a more sort of regional railway, right? Regional railway network. Another issue that I sort of see with Go Transit long term is that again, it is a very hub and spoke model, right? There are single lines that run to and from Toronto Union Station to outwards. And what they're doing right now, as evident by this extension, is that they're sort of just stretching them all out further and further, right?
Right.
Like you said before, one of the key things that has to happen if they want to become a regional rail network, and if you think they should become a regional rail network, is exactly sort of the um the suburb to suburb uh the suburb to suburb connections, right? Because right now, again, if you want to go between London and somewhere else, like another one of their lines, it would just be absolutely
It'd
horrific.
be terrible because
Four
you have to
hours
go to
plus
Toronto
another.
first.
Yeah, precisely. And so that's another thing that makes me question this motive, right? It's are you really promoting becoming a regional rail if you're just extending one of the lines to be twice as long as it was before, rather than promoting more interregional transportation?
Yeah,
What do you
like
think about that?
I don't. I think. I mean, I wish they just had more money to begin with. But I think if they want to be a regional rail system, they can't rely solely on the hub and spoke model. But it does make me think of Chicago, because they're very similar in how Metro is literally designed around a hub and spoke system. But I think they do a slightly better job of maintaining more all day frequencies on some of their commuter rail lines. Um, but even that has its flaws, and I think at some point they might need I mean, it's going to be really difficult to build tracks within the suburbs, but they're going to need somehow some kind of connector that, I don't know, goes from like Brampton to like, I don't know, Scarborough, like something that just goes around the outside of the city, like Copenhagen is built, or like I think Washington D.C. is building something in Maryland. Like you need something that just goes through the suburbs, and I don't know if Go Transit can actually do that, like building rail tracks or whatnot. But functionally, if they want a regional rail system, they can't rely on the hub and spoke model, and I think they need to, like you said, they should probably stop just extending their services and focus on maybe building new services that actually just connect their existing track network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. I mean, um it's wait, hold on. Dude, pause the recording 1 sec. Well, I mean, it's just, like how feasible do you think that is, right?
Not
Of
feasible.
build not feasible. Building an entire ring around all of the suburbs, yeah? Cuz
Yeah, because when you look at the cities in the U.S. that are trying to do it, they're so delayed, and there's often political backlash. And I'm not familiar with how conservative that part of of Ontario is, but I'm sure they aren't. They're still obsessed with their cars.
oh, certainly. Very much so. Very much so. And like like if you just look at the route network, right? Just another really basic thing. Just the number of spokes that there are is already leaving out a lot of areas, right? So even if, right, you build one big, massive, you know, sort of loop line. This is not a subway, this is commuter rail. That would still require, hours and hours of transit and just moving around, inconvenience to get from one suburb to another suburb, which, not to mention, still can't happen, especially on this current schedule, right? It's you know it's again, one of those I think, the big three problems, and it's just like, which one do you tackle first, right? Number one is how many spokes there are. Like, for example, the Dufferin area between the Kitchener and the Barrie lines is just completely unserved by trains. Second one is the scheduling, which just is really horrible. And number three is how far do you want it to extend? Obviously, Go has chosen that how far we need to extend is the big question to tackle, but it's I the best contrast, the best sort of comparison that we can make is when they announced its longest service yet between Toronto and Niagara Falls a few years back, where they had GO trains running, where they have GO trains running, between Toronto and all the way across around Lake Ontario to Niagara Falls, which I believe would take like what,
It looks like it takes like 2 hours and
two
21
hours,
minutes.
right? That one and the one to Kitchener itself, those are already sort of pushing the limits of the travel time, because Niagara Falls is, sort of also not really part of the Toronto metropolitan area either. But they were able to extend it to there, right?
Yeah.
The difference between these two is that the time, it takes a lot less time to get to Niagara Falls, but also the second factor is that Niagara Falls has a pull factor. London doesn't. And that's why, for doubling the time for a lot of the non-existent demand, as we talked about before, it's not really solving anything while also costing a lot of expenditures. And they're not and I don't think GoTrans is focusing on the problems that matter at hand in Toronto itself, with the current network.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think Go Transit has really the ability to build new trackage and actually create more of like a subway system of commuter or of regional rail. And I mean, it'd be amazing if they could do that, but I think they would have to just rely more on other connections, and to some degree that's happening. Like there is the light rail line that runs in Kitchener and Waterloo that connects some of those suburbs into the Kitchener area, which is great. But then, like, when you get closer to the actual Toronto city center, like it's still hub and spoke all the way into the city, where then you actually get the metro lines, which don't go all directly into the city center, but outside of the city, like they're still constantly suffering from that problem. And I guess maybe there's
Mm-hmm.
buses that fill in some of those gaps, but it's still suburban buses. So they're not great.
Yeah, let me actually ask you that question, because this is sort of the problem that cities situated on one body of water face, right? Especially like Chicago, like Toronto, and with any other coastal cities. You have to sort of one of your sides is sort of cut off, so you sort of have to, you know, operate, especially if your city center is on the water, you have to operate in different spokes, right? Um, how do you think Toronto is doing a good job of connecting its current spokes, its current center, uh, like how many spokes it has, and the suburban bus connections in between them?
I think it's doing some things well, and I guess with coastal cities, it does make it easy to run maybe a rail line just along the water and just go through the city center. Like they probably could just connect the Lakeshore West and the Lakeshore East lines into one line, and that way you can just go straight from like Hamilton up into the northeastern suburbs, and then those have bus connections at essentially every single station, which is good. Like you don't want just straight parking lot, so then somebody without a car has to like call an Uber or something or have someone pick them up. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
does a really good job, and I think to my knowledge, most of the northern stations still have a bus at every station. Like I was concerned initially that the Bloomington GO station was really just cars only, but I believe they have some buses too,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think is critical because if you don't have, like I said earlier, you need buses to at least ensure there's some mobility for everyone. If you don't have a car to pick you up or you didn't drive there in the morning, so I think Toronto does a good job with the coastal cities like Mississauga and Hamilton. That the Lakeshore West line is great because there's frequency and all, but I think it's much harder, like you said, to have rail lines that aren't like a hub and spoke system directly if you're having to go out into the suburbs. Because if you're not like a circular city, like I don't know Denver, you can't have like what the R line in Denver, RTD, where you just run along the freeway median in the outskirts of the city.
Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, like what you said before about, for example, having the one line along the coast between like the Lakeshore West and Lakeshore East connected. I mean, I guess what sort of happens is that after terminating, after stopping at Union Station, it just one train becomes the train of the other line, right? So it's just sort of like that. Um, do you think this is something that could maybe improve connectivity and be better? Like if you just have like with their current spokes, right? Instead of having them all terminate, fixing their schedule by instead of having them all just terminate at Union Station, have them just immediately go on to become a train of another line. Because that's currently not what's happening on
Yeah,
most of the
that I think
lines.
would be effective, and that's kind of like what Japan does, with the inner running of trains, and they could do that too with other lines. Like you could have what is it? You could have the Kitchener line or any of the lines, the whatever the orange line is. I can't. I think it says
The Milton
the
line.
Milton line and the Kitchener line. Like those could then interrun into the line like the line up to Barrie or the Richmond Hill line. You could just interline those, and then that creates, I guess, some more. I guess it eliminates a transfer, but it still doesn't solve the problem of the travel time because if you were wanting to go from Kitchener to Richmond Hill, you still have to go through downtown, which isn't great, but I mean, it's better than having to transfer.
I mean, do you think there's anything like? Do you think the travel time should be something of concern at all? Because again, like as they established before, right? It'll be between, for example, those intermediate journeys. Um, and what a lot of people have been saying. Obviously, there will be some people who will travel between London and Toronto and all of that, but it's for a lot of the intermediate journeys as well between, for example, Stratford and Kitchener, and also for, for example, if you want to go from Kitchener to London in the other direction, that will be another 2 hours, which is the same travel time as between Kitchener and Toronto. Do you think travel time should be a concern at all for this project?
I think generally in any commuter rail project, it's probably the most important factor, at least because if the goal of commuter rail or any rail service is to take cars off the road, you have to be competitive with cars. And 2 hours from Kitchener to London is not competitive with cars. I'm pretty sure you can do it in at least 90 minutes or less. And if you want to get people to take the route and you still only have one service a day, it better be competitive with driving. And if it's not, then it's not really serving its purpose. So
But what they're also saying is that like this is a new option for people that just didn't have it at all. Like for example, the population who don't own cars, which certainly that is also what public transit is designed for, right? People who don't have the option of taking cars. If you're in Kitchener, you can now go to London without having to rely on that of a car. Obviously, like even if you were to just drive, right? London to Toronto would cost 2 hours. Would take 2 hours directly. If there are some small improvements on the time speed, like maybe reduce it slightly below 4 hours, would you think that's acceptable for people? Because that's also achieving another purpose of public transit.
hmm yeah, I mean, it's still just interesting because you have the Via Rail before, so maybe it's just adding one more trip. And if you're going from London towards Toronto, it leaves so early that for a normal person just looking to make that trip who doesn't have a car, I think it loses some of its value. And then again, the train on the way back is more reasonable because I think it leaves Toronto at like around 4, then it gets to London just after 8. So in that case, that's I think more useful to people looking to make that trip. But the morning trip, I think you're much better off just using Via Rail. In which case, I don't think the new trip adds something. But especially, I mean, for the people without cars, I don't think time matters as much, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. I I mean, I guess, just again, for me personally, right? Because my family has a lot of is pretty involved in this area, and I have utilized Go Transit a lot. At least to and from London, it would certainly be not a bad option for commuters, right? If you're only commuting for work, then it is serviceable. If you're doing it for other purposes, maybe not so. And that's another thing which I think we should also talk about. Because what GoTransit has also been doing is promoting the service by saying that, oh, this is a sort of travel line, right? Like you can travel from Toronto to the beautiful city of London, Ontario for some reason. And I don't know. I just personally cannot. I think this is sort of another issue which it just doesn't make sense because it just feels like they're trying so hard to force this to work, um, by having it, trying to get it to appeal to tourists as well to go from, Toronto to London or whatever. It's not like the line to Niagara Falls at all, but do you think there's a legitimate area there of this being used for tourism?
Well, on Go Transit, I'm still gonna have difficulty believing it because, like I said earlier, the trains are not designed for 4-hour trips and for people to be sitting there, and you still have to factor in that they're designed for commuters who don't bring large suitcases on the train, so there's really no luggage storage either. And being a regular commuter on bi-level train cars, there's the legroom isn't great, especially for sitting in the groups of 4, and for the most part, like the seats have no amenities. I don't know if Go Transit gives you outlets or not, but if they don't,
Oh,
like,
there are outlets, yeah.
yeah, so I guess maybe they're better than most bi-level train cars, but they're still not like the most comfortable for a 4-hour train ride. Eventually, you would want something nicer, like an Amtrak seat or even Via Rail. And again, that's where I keep coming back to Via Rail too. Like, someone's gonna have to prioritize Go over Via Rail if Go is gonna be successful, and maybe I guess they'll have to do it based on the time it leaves. And in that case, that would be the only way I would think they could be successful with tourists.
I personal experience with both cities. Yeah, it certainly makes sense what you say. It would just need it. There would need to be a major overhaul if you want to make this feasible for tourists. There would need to be a major overhaul of the schedule to make it fit into a tourist day, tourist, any suburban visitors day, and it would only be able to do that in order to remain competitive against Via Rail. But I mean, it's sort of I think there's also like a structural London, Ontario is by no means a touristic city. Is sort of
No.
what I'm trying to get at. And trying for if you go online, if you go online to go transit websites, right? This is exactly what they say. London makes a great destination for a mini vacation with the family. It's kids will love making discoveries at the London Children's Museum and playing in the many parks that are within easy walking distance of the train station. Wow, how appealing for a 4-hour train journey, you
Well,
know?
and let's not forget that at the present moment, the train gets into London at 8 p.m. and then the next train back to Toronto doesn't leave until 5:20 a.m. So it would require that people spend the night there, and there's no possibility of a day trip if you're coming from Toronto.
It's probably a night trip, dude. Like midnight trip to London,
It
Ontario.
force people to spend more money staying overnight, in addition to the 4 hours they already spent on the train getting there, and then force them to wake up at what 4:30 so they can get to the train station on time.
Not great, to say the least. Um, and that's not even to mention, just how boring the scenery the entire route is, how boring the trip is itself, because just the ride for example, from Kitchener to Toronto itself, right? After you leave Kitchener, there's nothing. The scenery immediately becomes nothing, and it's a normal commuter rail line in the Ontario countryside, right? Not the most comfortable. There's not even tables on the GO trains. It's just plain seats. The seats are they're certainly the trains are certainly clean. That's a plus. There are outlets, half of which work. Um, Sometimes they don't work. But other than that, the journey itself. We always say, right? It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Yeah, the journey isn't really something to write home about at all. And trying to force it to become a tourist destination isn't amazing either. But yeah, but
Yeah,
that's
not
sort
at
of
all.
just personal rants. I also want to ask you about sort of this question, which I think is decently interesting.
Mhm.
How do you think that this new connection, London to Toronto by Go Transit in the Go Transit network, how do you think it will affect people who live along these lines? How do you think it will affect their options for going to other places that are not Toronto or elsewhere along the line?
Well, that might be the one thing that's a benefit because since you have the train leaving so early in the morning, you can connect in Toronto to practically anywhere. Although, of course, the trains are still built for rush hour for the most part, so there's not a lot of service going out of Toronto in the morning. But I think there's definitely, I mean, there's Via Rail connections and some trains run frequently, so you could in theory transfer in Toronto and go to Niagara Falls. Um, but I think still that timing issue is going to prevent most people from actually having good connections because you would have to wait until the afternoon for trains to go out of Toronto.
Like again, with I think that's also revealing of the other problems that we discussed before. Because like again, with the connection to Niagara Falls, right? The timing, it may work out decently, but the thing is, again, you have to remember that this extension to London is taking the northern route through Kitchener, which means that it's not going to be connecting up with the Lakeshore West line, which will be able to transit to Niagara Falls. It's up through Kitchener, which means in order to get to Niagara Falls, you'd have to take it all the way up to Kitchener and then down into Toronto Union Station before going around to Niagara Falls. That is a horrific trip for another, that's what, 4 hours from London to Toronto and then another two. So 6 hours to get to Niagara Falls versus if you just drove, it would have been what, like a plane 2 hours, 2.5 hours.
Or you could take the Via Rail to Hamilton, then transfer to Via Rail, or go down to Niagara Falls, which would be a lot quicker.
Or the Go station. It would be a lot quicker like that. But the thing is, that's sort of how do you say this, right? My question, another one of the questions in that regard is sort of why is Go Transit, if Go Transit is going to go is does want to sort of link London to its network, why is it only via Kitchener and not via Hamilton as well? If not for anything but cost, because that would make more sense as well to offer, number one, offer more connections, but also number two, to if their goal is to say, hey, we're doing this because there are other intermediate connections between these cities, decently sized cities, as well as maybe Stratford and St. Mary's, that want to be added to our line. There's even more of a case to say that, because you have the cities of Brantford and the towns of Woodstock and Ingersoll between London and Hamilton between them.
Yeah, and that seems way more viable. And maybe it's like a because in a cost issue, it is more trackage, but it's quicker because you have higher speeds, and they already serve Hamilton City Center, so they can just take that cutoff and go to London. I mean, I wish I knew why they didn't do that because it seems much more logical.
It would be more beneficial for me because that's, my aunt and uncle, my family lives along that portion instead of Stratford St. Mary's. So if that were made, I would be on board 100%. I'd be really happy. Wouldn't have to drive like an hour to get to the nearest GO station. I could just walk out and then boom, we're there to the GO station.
Yeah, or maybe Via Rail just had an objection because I'm sure Via Rail does really well in that section, considering it's fast and frequent.
Well, the thing is with Via Rail in this section, it's just stupidly expensive. Like, I think I was looking. I think let me. When I looked at it before, right, from where my aunt and uncle were to Toronto, I believe a round trip was $40, which
That's
is not.
yeah, that's not
It's not amazing at
not
all.
cheap.
Converse, which is why Go Transit was so appealing, because um, going from like driving an hour and then getting the Go train for the same amount of time into Toronto would only have cost, like, I believe, $8, which
Which
comparatively
is a
is
lot better.
a lot better. And it's sort of why it's so enticing, between Kitchener and between all of the major lines as well, especially with the rising cost of everything. The train is becoming a more viable option. The problem is, will it also be the same for people who live along this new extended route? Because they'll have to pay a much higher fare, presumably.
Yeah, I'm not really sure I'm convinced yet of any of the reasoning for it. I mean, it's great that there's a new service, but I think if they want to actually make it successful in the future, they're going to need to upgrade everything about the line, and make it more convincing to writers. But that does end our episode because it's been quite a long time discussing this issue, and I imagine we'll do future episodes on Go Transit at some point because there's really a lot more to discuss about them, and considering they also have the UP Express too that we didn't even talk about. I think this warrants future discussion as well. So stay tuned for that. But thank you for listening.